Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. So today I want to talk with you about my experience, which now is 11 years long experience in martial arts, and I want to discuss with you the different experience that I had and trying to share with you the pros and cons of everything I have done till now, be it in HEMA or in the other activities which I approached for cross training. So let's start from the very beginning, which is, of course, for many HEMA people, the very beginning is some kind of reenactment club, or at least it was 10, 11 years ago. So I approached the reenactment, and my club wasn't like a huge reenactment club. We are in the countryside, so it was relatively tiny, and we don't have access to, let's say, a lot of information. We had our instructors, but we were not really into sword fighting. They had the manuals, the books. They had the Fiore delivery books, the 133, but they weren't really into them, so they weren't reading the books, let's say. So what happened is that, yeah, we did some kind of sword fighting, but in the end it wasn't, it was kind of a mixture of different ideas of people that they met around, other instructors that studied the manuals in weird ways. So we had, let's say, some basic fencing, which was more or less in line with Fiore delivery, and we didn't use any kind of protective equipment in our training. We didn't even know what we were actually training, so it was halfway between some, let's say, reenactment fighting, so let's call it stage fighting to be kind in a sense, and in another sense we were also competitive, so there was some kind of free fencing, but which followed some specific rule to not get hurt, even if sometimes, of course, it happened. So we were mainly working with horizontal cuts, which are easy to see and to parry. There were a lot of strikes to the legs, funny enough, because it was impossible to thrust or answer to the head while doing so. I mean, with control, of course. And so the fighting was kind of weird, the training was kind of weird. It was interesting, of course, because it made me discover sword fighting, but it didn't give me a lot compared to everything else I've done after that. But of course it started me on the path, so I'm really grateful. And that's probably the only thing that it did for me. I don't even consider it some kind of martial arts or whatever, it was just some place in which I was swinging my sword. So after the first year, I discovered by pure chance the HEMA through YouTube. I have found an old YouTube video, which was one of the first tournaments, I think, in Germany probably. I can't remember the name. And yeah, so I have seen the tournament, and I wanted to train HEMA. So I started to buy some masks, some protective equipment around Spes just made in those years the first AP jacket. And so we started to buy that equipment, and we started training with it. So I also approached the sources in the same period because, of course, I entered in knowledge of HEMA and then of the sources together with it. Even if I known them before, as I mentioned with my reenactment experience, but I was the one which had to read the stuff in my mind, and then at some point I understood that I had to do it, and so that's how I started to approach the sources. So basically it was like no one is doing it, so I have to do it, and so I started. So I, funny enough, started with the German longsword, as many people in that period, so in 2012, 2013. And I started with the Ringek, the Dresden manual, which was at first translated by Keith Farrell. Well, no, Andres Engström, I think, from like ancient German to Sweden, and then from Keith from Sweden to English, and then I translated it from English to Italian, and I started to work over it. Of course, it was a translation of a translation, etc. So it was really hard to approach. But that said, so that period of time in which I started reading myself the manual and then trying out what it was in the manual definitely improved my fencing compared to before. I started to figure out some things, but I really hadn't a lot of ideas about how to approach the things I was reading if I watch at myself back then. And so, yeah, I started to figure out mainly, I would say, sword and handling movements, not really tactics and approach to the opponent. Even some techniques were funny. I was too obsessed with the manual. So, for example, one of the first things that in basically every medieval Lichtenauer manual you find is that you have to always step with the right cut, and like you have always step while cutting, because otherwise your cut is not strong enough, etc. And so I was doing it every time, even in the techniques which didn't had a motivation to step, like parry riposte actions, let's say, like the Zorno Hort action. And so I was doing something which was not useful to the technique. It was in excess. So funny enough, I was too obsessed with the manual. That was the problem, because it was the tool which helped me to go through my fencing, and so I was too faithful to my manual, and so I was trying to always apply every single thing that it was in the manual, which in the end you end up discovering that is not always a good idea. Funny enough, rarely is a good idea. So there are many instructions which are useful, but every one of them in the correct moment and at the correct time. So that period of time was me approaching HEMA. After that, I started to gain some, let's say, some knowledge, and I'd done my first couple of competitions back then, which were the very first competitions in Italy. And I was kind of delusional, because I had a very bad outcome from that competitions, and so I started to train to find out another way of training. So instead of telling myself, yeah, I am the problem, so I have to figure out the way to improve myself, I tried to find out a smarter way to train, which was not good or bad. I mean, it was bad for me now, considering because I lost some time in a sense, but in the end helped me finding out another environment. So I approached the minimal equipment environment, mainly training sword and buckler, and at the same time I started to practice jiu-jitsu and jodo, which are two traditional styles. So two koryu in Japanese, I hope I'm spelling it right, which basically train the, let's say, ancient art in the way they were supposed to be trained, let's say. So there were a lot of katas, there were a lot of, let's say, yeah, partner drills, but everything was staged, etc. So talking about HEMA and my minimal equipment experience, it was definitely useful. So it boosted my confidence to a point, but then it have been kind of, it was good and bad in a sense. So it was good because it cleared my form. It increased my awareness of the opponent's weapon. It increased the awareness of the danger of doing certain actions at certain specific times, because of course I was without any equipment sometimes, or only with my mask and some leather gloves or stuff like that. And so I had to be careful at approaching fighting and training also because of this. So on one side, it cleared my form, it informed me on some actions, so the danger of certain actions. I was careful at approaching the opponent, but at the same time I was able to fight at a shorter measure because of course without protective equipment you can't do certain explosive actions. So you can't be as fast as you want in delivering certain actions. So on that technical side, I gained something, but I didn't lost something because I didn't had something to lose. But I gained something from on that side, but I wasn't able to gain the other part which I needed to improve my fencing as a whole. So that's what happened in that period. The negative aspect of that, and also of I would say training. Mainly, I will say about training the ancient Japanese martial arts, which I'm now going to talk about, was that I developed some kind of elitist attitude toward other ways of training. So I was like really obsessed with my way of training. It was the best, and everyone else was doing something stupid or wrong or whatever. Even if when I had the chance to fight someone following other rules, I always tried to avoid that situation. So, and of course I was also convincing myself that it was the best thing to do because blah blah blah, motivations. So that was also the same in the Japanese environment. So ancient Japanese martial arts environment. So as I said, I was training in jiu-jitsu. My style of jiu-jitsu was not the one, like the modern one. Now, generally speaking, when everyone is talking about jiu-jitsu right now, everyone thinks about Brazilian jiu-jitsu. But my one was a Japanese koryu, and so shared some similarities in a sense with Aikido. So there were a lot of wrist leverages and manipulation, etc. It was mainly wrestling on the arms of the opponent. There was some wrestling on the chest, but not a lot. There was not grappling on the legs, basically. There was a striking into it, because it was meant to be some kind of complete martial arts, but it was kind of static and robotic in a sense, you know. So it gave me something in relation to the way in which now I perceive, the way in which I can manipulate, let's say, the arms of my opponent if I want to do some kind of action, some kind of wrestling action. But at the same time, some actions which I learned weren't, I will say, really functional. So I learned something about how the body moves around, but in terms of actual fighting, it didn't give me a lot. Instead, I will say that Jodo was better, because Jodo improved my... So if you don't know what Jodo is basically the way of the Jo. The Jo is the short Japanese stick, which is theoretically speaking, like 120 centimeters is considered the standard measure for everyone, which is funny because like everyone is of different length. But anyway, so this short stick is always against the katana. So you are fighting against a katana. Now, the story behind this is that style of Jodo has been created by Muso Gonosuke, which ended up fighting Musashi. He basically lost, I think, but survived or had some kind of a draw. No, I think, yes, he lost the first time, then he developed this kind of stick technique to beat him, and probably he ended up fighting him again and ended up in a draw or something like that. That's the story. I don't know. I can't remember it pretty well, but there is some kind of background behind it. So Jodo is basically short stick against katana. It's you basically have the basic strikes and the katas. So when you are practicing basic strikes, you're generally doing solo or with a partner, which gives you, let's say, the measure and goes backward when you are striking your actions, because of course you can't hit the opponent. You don't have any kind of protective equipment because of course it's a traditional style. That's something, yeah, I can't pronounce myself on this. I think it was mainly about training form, and in that sense it was useful, because I think that Jodo gave me a lot, even if it is the practice that I considered lesser at that time. Because I already practiced some kind of weapon-based martial arts, and because it was more realistic by my point of view, I considered HEMA more important. So then there was the katas. The katas were, of course, stage. It was basically stage fighting with weird timings. So in that sense, katas don't give you a lot, because the timing of the fight is, I mean, it can be realistic because fighting can have any single time possible. It can be slow, fast, and a mixture of them in different ways of slowness and fastness, let's say. But the timing of that kata was really funny, and in that sense, talking about how I apply now sword fighting, it didn't give me a lot. It was really interesting because you had to be really focused to not hurt the opponent, or better, the opponent, the training partner. So in that sense, it's really, psychologically speaking, is a really good training, because you have to be always focused on what you're doing, and that's probably the best thing about, generally speaking, all traditional martial arts. You always have to be present with your mind in relation to what you're doing, or otherwise you end up hurting the opponent. Now, that's funny because you learn this thing, but it's a paradox, because it's good for training, of course, because you learn how to take care of the opponent while training, but you are training how to fight, and so you're basically at the same time learning the opposite of what you have to learn, so which is hurting the opponent. So there is so much care about not hurting the opponent that, funny enough, it becomes a problem when you have to apply that kind of actions in an idealistic or realistic environment. So that's my experience with that choreo. I also practiced these two styles of Japanese martial arts for 4 years, which more or less, it was the same period of time in which I trained 3-4 years with minimal equipment in sword and buckler. Then I switched, and so for different motivation, I started to learn, knowing people. I started to open up my mind to different training methods, and I have gone back and ended up picking up the jacket again, my fencing jacket, to fight again with the jacket. And I had some experiences fighting other people, which made me think, oh my God, I am not able to deal with this situation. Even a slightly stronger hit compared to what I was used to was like bothering me, and so I said, so I have to start training again with this method. And so at that point I started a new moment of my training life, let's say. So I briefly mentioned before that I also trained 1 year Aikido, and I have to say, sorry for whatever Aikido practitioner out there, that considering all the things that I have trained is the one that gave me the lesser. Probably I didn't have trained it enough, so 1 year is not enough. But generally speaking is even more, let's say, unrealistic by my point of view compared to the other traditional martial arts which I have done, basically. Again, it was really interesting for the focus that you had to put into it, which is the same thing for any traditional martial art. But yeah, there was some, again, wrestling on the arms, mainly. It was super interesting. The principles that you use are realistic, so it's not that everything is stupid or everything is staged or doesn't work. Things work, but you can't train them because you are not in the correct and safe environment to apply the things. So you can't break bones or dislocate things. And so you have to do it in a way which save your opponent. And because you have to do it in this way, it simply doesn't work. And also the timing of it becomes different. And you have to do actions longer to do it step by step. So it's really weird in a sense. So unluckily, Aikido didn't give me a lot. It was an interesting experience also to learn something more. That said, jump back on HEMA, started to train again with my jacket on, and that's the moment at which I approached the Fiore dei Liberi. So it was like 2017. 2017, I approached Fiore dei Liberi. I start to, you can easily follow from that moment on my story on YouTube. So I started to fence more with the jacket, to train more with the jacket. I started to create my own interpretation of Fiore, which I don't consider complete, but let's say almost. I have a very good grasp of the manual itself. And from that point on is the moment in which I actually developed the most. So I started again to compete in the end of 2018 or the first of 2019, I can't remember precisely, with I would say good feedbacks, good outcome from that kind of competitions, even if I didn't compete for years back then. And so that was probably what made me, let's say, more happy about the results that I had, even if I needed so much time to get to that point, because I was basically having all these different training environments, different situations in which I ended up training and fighting, etc. I changed my mind about different things. I became elitist for a period. Then I became too obsessed with the sources for a period again. And then I started to be more relaxed in my approach to training. I would say that from 2019 to now, I basically had my last, I would say, evolution in terms of how I approach training. So I always kept working with the manuals, but at the same time, I also started to consider more other aspects, so tactics in relation to my opponent, and the actual environment in which I was applying my fencing, so sparring, tournament, considering them similar but slightly different, considering the way in which you approach the tournament, so the rule set of the tournament, and trying to have a grasp over it to perform better, because this is also tactics, as I mentioned in other videos. So, or better strategy, in a sense. So that was, let's say, my last evolution in terms of how I approached the sword fighting. In the meantime, I approached a couple of other activities. One was archery, which was really interesting, and it helped me fixing some problems which I had in my shoulders, because it simply does the opposite that you do with the sword many times. So with the sword you are pushing a lot forward, and with archery your back muscles are doing like this, so your shoulders are doing like this, and so it was compensating this kind of attitude, and it was really, really useful for this, and also for my focus, because and the relaxation also, funny enough, because when I'm shooting the bow, I'm kind of relaxed because I don't feel pressure. I'm not so obsessed with it. For some people it's not that relaxing, for me it is. It is useful otherwise to consider what a goal really is, because with archery you have a simple goal, which is hitting the target, and that's it, and you have one movement. So in this sense it's really interesting to practice as an activity, because it focuses you on one single goal, doing one single thing, and you have to do it at the best as you can. Instead, like fencing is compared to it is incredibly huge. But you can't have as much focus on one single thing as in archery, of course. So the other activity which I approached, the other martial art / combat sport is Muay Thai, which I am still practicing and I am enjoying a lot. And considering the cross training, as I mentioned on Facebook some days ago, which I have done, is probably the best activity which I approached. It's giving me a lot in terms of hand-to-hand fighting, of course, but also in terms of balance and a lot of different aspects, like confidence when I am approaching the opponent, confidence when I am under measuring doing my parry riposte, mobility of my torso while parrying and while doing actions, body awareness, generally speaking. So it's a really good, really nice activity. It's probably the best cross-training activity which I had till now. So this is basically in short the story of my, let's say, martial practices. I could talk about this for hours probably because I have many things to say about every single activity that I have done, because I have practiced them, most of them, for many years, and so I didn't pay justice to, let's say, any kind of activity which I mentioned. But it's just to give you an idea of how I approached certain things, what they gave them of positive and negative. The last few words I want to mention about all of this is that how I think is better to train HEMA right now. So I think it's better to have a variety of approaches, ideally speaking, but if you can't, it's better to train with the jacket on, with good protective equipment and with safe swords, because I've seen also many accidents these years. Sorry, my English is betraying me because I'm talking since quite a lot. And so that's probably the best method which I ended up using in my approach. I think it's good to be faithful to what you are practicing, be it in relation to your sources or the tournament in terms of competition. And you can do both, that's my opinion. You can approach the thing in two different ways. You can approach fighting in two different ways. In the end, it's not that different, even if it seems so. What it gives you is that it improves your way to deal with different situations. It increases your tactical awareness, the way in which you adapt to different situations, and generally speaking, makes you a better fencer. It is also useful to train sometimes without the jacket on, etc. Yes, it may be. It's useful also to handle your weapon sometimes without the big bulky gloves, because it's slightly different. Generally speaking, the more experience you have, the better it is. If you have a specific goal, instead, if you, on the short term or also on the long term, like 1 year or so, if you want to win that specific tournament, then for that year you have to focus on that thing. So that's what I learned. So improving, generally speaking, in your fencing is one thing. Obtaining a goal, a specific goal, is another thing. You can pursue both, but generally speaking, at different times in your life. So that's it, a couple of words about what I learned in these basically 10, 11 years. There is a lot of things I would have to say more, but I think that this discussion may help someone in improving their own path in HEMA. So, that said, people, thanks for watching. Remember that if you want to support the channel, you can join my Patreon community, link in the description. And if you don't want to join the community, but you want to help me, there is the new Super Thanks feature down below the video, which you can use. So again, thanks for watching, and see you next time.